The next thing is that authentic liberation is a process of humanization. Right? Authentic liberation must be a process of humanization. And the idea of humanization is simply to do the following, right? And I have it here. It's an attempt to argue that through the act of struggle, right? And actually I can erase all of this. It is an attempt to argue that through the act of struggle, a state of affairs wherein the oppressor oppresses the oppressed, right? Through the act of struggle, we will be on par, right? Right? So that there has to be a mutual recognition, right? This is the state of affairs that we're attempting to get to. This is a liberated state of affairs, right? It used to be the case that I was dehumanized, right? I struggled for equality, humanization. This is dehumanization, this is humanization, right? So dehumanization here, struggle to attain humanization, and obviously then I'm liberated, right? So this is what we're attempting to do, right? We're attempting to sort of elevate our status as an oppressed group to be on par with the oppressor. Okay, through this act of liberation, right, we recognize that this is a process of attaining our humanization, right? We want to regain a recognition that we as oppressed people are the same as, right, or equal to our former oppressors, right? There really is no oppressed contradiction or student-teacher contradiction. It's just people, right? So authentic liberation, which this is a representation of, reinforces the process of humanization. The next, authentic liberation utilizes consciousness with the world, right? Consciousness with the world. What does that mean? Consciousness with the world, right? Rather than consciousness in the world, and we'll see what that means. Consciousness with the world is a recognition that there are objects in the world, and that these objects may be acted upon, right? So that these objects may be acted upon, but we cannot keep and treat, we cannot keep or treat individual human beings as we do objects, right? Consciousness with the world, right? And we said this before, we have two different types of consciousness in Freire's account. We have what's known as internal consciousness, the consciousness of my mind. We also have what's known as accessible consciousness, things that are accessible. Anything that I see in the world is accessible to me. If I see something in the world as an accessible, and we'll just put, if I see something in the world as accessible consciousness, I recognize that I can have an idea of that accessible consciousness internally. But all that I have done is I've imposed, right? I've imposed a static world onto my mind, right? This creates docile people. This creates people who are incapable of thought, incapable of creating their own ideas. The only way that they come about recognizing any truth in the world is that they're told what the truth is, and it's sort of embedded in the act of memory, right? Right? This is not consciousness with the world. Consciousness with the world is both directions, right? It's both directions. It's a recognition that there's a back and forth between my recognition of things in the world, for example, this Rubik's Cube, a recognition that I have within my head somewhere stored the algorithms to solve this, right? And I can verify this by an exchange with the object, right? It's not just the information being imposed upon my mind, right? Sort of in this, like a cookie cutter example, right? It's not the case that our mind is simply this malleable, pliable sheet of cookie dough, and the world impresses itself in sort of like a Lockean sense on our mind, on our consciousness, and therefore that's how we come to learn. In actuality, it's a relationship. It's this association between internal consciousness and accessible consciousness, right? It's this flow, and this is the idea of consciousness with, right? consciousness with the world. So when he talks about consciousness with the world, it seems pretty sort of subtle, but this is what he's talking about in reference to consciousness with. The next is the authentic liberation. Authentic liberation is based on what he calls problem-posing education, right? Problem-posing education. So we recognize that the banking concept is in opposition to the problem-posing concept. Right? Two different forms of educational concepts for Freire. The first form is the banking concept. The second form is the problem-posing concept. He's going to critique this traditional account, this banking concept of education as a static, homogenized, dehumanized process of education. He's going to classify this as sort of his account. Not necessarily, Freire wouldn't say it's his account, but a more accessible, a more exchangeable, if you will, account. And then last, this act of authentic liberation is based on cognition, right? It's based, and that's important, it's based on cognition. And this idea of cognition isn't as intuitive as it seems. In subsequent videos, I'll go into more detail on sort of the role of cognition in Freire. Cognition, as we said, first takes into account the two modes of consciousness, right? One, the mode being accessible consciousness. Two, the mode being internal consciousness, and the relationship between what is accessible and it being internalized. What we recognize is it's not so much the information that goes in that's difficult, right? The banking concept, if we were to separate this, the banking concept talks about how accessible consciousness becomes internal, right? That's what the banking concept basically does. How do I make accessible knowledge internal to the agent, to the student, to the oppressed? And we've talked about how we do that through the act of domination, through the act of subordination, through the act of oppression, through the act of violence. You control individuals by an abuse of your power, and they conform to your will because they want to avoid that abuse. Right? So this banking concept is sort of a transition between accessible, and I don't know, accession, I don't know, whatever, accessible information and internal consciousness, right? The problem-posing concept is different. We recognize that there's a human, we recognize that there's an other, right? And what ends up happening is that there's an exchange. Information is given to the oppressed group or the student or whoever. Actually, it wouldn't be an oppressed group, and it wouldn't be a student. It would be, information is given to another human being. That information is, and we'll say that that information is, you know, that information is, let's say, K. K is internalized by the student. That information is given back as, like, K prime 1, right? So that the information is different, and it keeps on changing. This is the problem-posing concept, as opposed to the banking concept, where information is just given and it remains sort of static and dormant. There's no transformation of knowledge. Okay, so that's the first of the two forms of liberation. The second form of liberation is obviously inauthentic liberation. Right?